The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. And this week's opening quote comes from Elie Wiesel. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Egan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Recently you have probably heard me talking quite a bit about history, quite a bit about the lost nation of Tartaria, a nation that existed in Europe that nobody seems to know about. It's a nation that's been expunged from history, and yet it still exists on many maps. Well, it still exists on many old maps anyway. It doesn't exist on too many new maps, but you can still find it on old maps if you search for it, and it does appear to be quite a well-known and well-established nation. Of course, any academic sources that you question about this nation, they will simply tell you it was an area of land. It was never actually a nation, and yet, as I've also pointed out previously, we can find flags of this nation. And if it was just an area and not a nation, then it wouldn't have a flag. So it was in fact a nation and not simply an area of land, and there's every indication that it had also spread out to become a worldwide civilization. This is very much suggested by the similar architecture in so many countries around the world, very old architecture, which is all very much the same. And this is what is termed Greco-Roman architecture. But one would ask, why would every country around the world be building their government buildings using the same architecture? You find this everywhere. You find it all through the Americas, you find it through South America, you find it even in Japan and Australia. So why would they be using this same style? That's the question. And even not just the architecture, but the symbolism, the motifs, the designs, even the clothing, the styles of clothing that people wear, these are all very similar all around the world. They may not seem that way when you first look at them on the surface, but when you really analyse things, you find that they all have a common root, which very much suggests that all of these nations, all of these cultures were all connected. And no matter how you look at it, this is very much what is indicated, ladies and gentlemen, and also through the discovery of a worldwide language, which was Magyar, or the root language of Hungarian, which was spoken by the Incas, by the Polynesians, and also by all the Australian Aboriginals, and many cultures all around the world seem to have spoken this language. Polynesians, Melanesians, all of the island cultures seem to have spoken it. In fact, Magyar seems to have been so common around the world that one might question if one were to apply Magyar translations to some of the lost languages that we still can't figure out, such as the Rondo and things like this. Perhaps we could find that there is a way of translating them if we use Magyar. Who knows? It's just a thought. And something else you've heard me talking about a great deal is the evidence suggesting a worldwide mud flood that happened as recently as 150 to 200 years ago. As I've mentioned before, there's a Russian channel run by a man called Philip Druzinin who is covering this quite extensively, and I do recommend you go and look at the research that he's done on this, because it is quite compelling. And you'll find that there is evidence of this mud flood that exists everywhere. I mean, it did happen, folks, and it was a physical flood, but it was not water, and it was an event that covered virtually the entire world. We can find evidence of this flood across Europe, across the Americas, even here in Australia. And evidence of this flood appears as buildings that have a sub-level, a level below ground, and also as many of the buildings that look like they were carved into rock faces, look like they were carved into cliffs. There's a very real possibility that they weren't carved into the cliffs, but simply the cliffs flowed over them, or perhaps the cliffs even became molten around them. But however it happened and however it manifested, suffice to say there is a good deal of evidence to indicate that the mud flood is a very, very genuine event, and it's very likely that it occurred in the mid to late 1840s. And there's a lot of people who've been putting a lot of research into this, and a lot of information is being uncovered about what has truly happened in the past. And our history appears to be very, very different to what the mainstream has taught us, to what we've learned in academic institutions, what we learned in schools. In fact, none of what we are taught in schools of what our history is backed up by physical evidence. All the physical evidence says something quite different. And there may be some people that would debate that. They'd say, well, no, we've got a lot of physical evidence to support the official timeline. But really, when you look at the physical evidence, you can construct any story you want to make it sort of fit with the evidence. But you have to leave a great deal of it out, which is why there's so many great mysteries and anomalous objects and all the names they think up for all the things they can't explain. You know, and ultimately, folks, if there's one artifact that is out of place, then the official version is wrong. And there are literally hundreds of artifacts that are out of place, if the official version is to be believed at all. And again, these are all sort of listed as anomalous objects and great mysteries and all shrouded in secrecy and presented as something that we just don't know how they did it. But really, if you can face the very real possibility that they don't fit because the timeline and the history that we're given is completely wrong, then you begin to see a little bit of the bigger picture. And it is wrong, folks. Our history is wrong. I have no qualms in saying that. It's completely wrong. Most of it has been completely fabricated, and I would suggest that it's been done absolutely deliberately for a very specific reason. The question is, how did they do it? How did they erase history so effectively? And what really happened? Well, what evidence suggests really happened is, as I said, this mud flood. There was a flood that's gone across the entire world, and the mud flood, because it is mud, it's not water, it appears to have come from the land itself. The question is, how did that occur? Was it a natural occurrence, or was it simply done by somebody or something? And the other question is, of course, why can no one remember this? How has it been so effectively expunged from human memory and expunged from our history? Well, as I've said before, how long would it take to change history and hide history? And effectively it would take 3 generations, but you could actually do it in one. If you were to remove the older people, well, most of the older people anyway, a high percentage of the population, just wipe them out and simply replace them with children. The children wouldn't know what history was, especially if they were children that had just been put in place after some sort of a cataclysm like a mud flood. And these children would believe any history that they were taught. I mean, they wouldn't even have an interest in history to begin with. You'd put them in place, set them to work, and they'd be too caught up in the rigours of everyday survival to ever even question where they come from or what they're doing there. I mean, for a child, it would just be the way things are. They would gradually grow up over generations, and you would just teach these new generations this new history. And when you look at the stories of old, the stories of the chimney sweeps and how so many children were working back in the old days, and we just thought it was terrible that there was child labour and that's the way they did it, but why was there so many children working? Why weren't the adults there to do the jobs that the children were doing? There's been a lot of photos that have been surfacing lately, a lot of old pictures, and you can go and find them yourself. If you look at any historical photos from around circa 1850, look at St. Petersburg, look at some of the major cities in the United States, major cities in England, major cities right across Europe around circa 1850, and you'll find very, very few people in the photographs. You see these big cities, but there's just no people around. Why is that? And another thing you can find, something that I found on a channel the other day, which is another channel that I've just found, which I really do recommend people go and look at. It's a channel called Conspiracies Are Us, and it's a very small channel. It's only got about 2,700 subscribers or something, and I cannot imagine why, because he's doing some very, very good dot connecting, and he does deserve more views. But what I saw on this channel was a video that he'd done. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put a link below in the description. And it's about 21 minutes long, but it was a video discussing foundlings and orphan trains in the late 1800s. And a foundling is a child which is abandoned and is found and cared for by someone else, or perhaps taken on to an orphanage or even an asylum, because there were many places that were set up and they were called asylums, and these were simply for people to care for children and for unmarried mothers to go and have their babies as well. And any woman who had a child out of wedlock circa 1850 was required by law to hand their baby over to a foundling home. And around circa 1860 to 1880, there were literally thousands, tens of thousands of foundlings which were being dropped off at orphanages all across the world, right across Europe, right across Russia, right across America, even here in Australia, New Zealand and Africa. It was about 200,000 children per annum were shipped from east to west across the United States. And this is what was happening in so-called orphan trains. And they just used to be shipped out there, and all the kids would get off the train and people would get up there and pick the children that they wanted, and then the train would be reloaded and they'd move on to the next town and they'd pick the children that they wanted. All the children were picked to use for labour. And it didn't matter if the children were related or anything, they were often separated and they were simply given whatever last name the people thought they should have, given whatever first name and last name kind of by lot. So there's no way of tracing the genealogy of these kids, like if a brother got separated from a sister or siblings got separated at all. If they went to another town, they were given another name and then they grew up and there would be no way they would be able to locate their siblings. So all of them were just completely thrown into a new life. And this was happening all around the world, and there were major enterprises in place set up to manage these children, to care for these children, to ship them all around the place. There's reports of certain cities in Italy, for example, that had up to 1,200 foundling homes in the cities just to accept the influx of foundlings that were coming into the areas. The question is, why? Where were all these children coming from? There's one place, or two places, I think, had 45,000 children delivered to them in 1 year. There's reports of, like I said, 200,000 per annum being shipped across the United States. There's reports of around about 100,000 per annum being shipped out of England to Australia, New Zealand and Africa. There's reports of children being shipped into major cities in Russia and then being sent out to rural areas, which is very strange because if the children were being found in rural areas and then being brought back to major cities in Russia, why were they then shipping them back out to rural areas? And the question is, if these cities are empty and there was very, very few people around, which is very much what is indicated by the photographs that you see, then where were all these children coming from? And again, there's every indication that all of these children were put to work. I mean, that's what is there in the documentation. All of these kids that were shipped everywhere all around the world were all put to work. So again, the question is, where were the adults? Why weren't the adults doing the work? And why exactly would so much labour be needed? You know, in a normal society, in a normal world, if things have gone along the timeline that we're told and there's just families going out and colonising new areas, you know, the settlers going out building their log cabins and having children, why would you need this huge influx of child labour to be sent so many places around the world? It's a very interesting question, ladies and gentlemen, and the question also must be asked, were the children brought into these countries and into these places as labour for the clean-up operation after the mud flood? Because there's a great deal of evidence to suggest this is what actually happened. And many of the stories about colonisation and all of this sort of stuff are very likely cover stories to hide the fact that these children were being shipped all around the world, and the stories of the foundlings even, of these foundling homes and these vast orphanages and all these things they needed. This is very likely a cover story as well, to explain the presence of all of these children. The question is, where were the children coming from? And really, when you look at this, folks, the figures are astronomical. They really are. And as I said, I'll put the link below. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put a link below to the video discussing the foundlings and the orphan trains. And if you're not watching this on YouTube, you can simply go to my website, thecrowhouse.com, and you'll find that the video is currently embedded on my homepage and will stay there for a couple of weeks. But I think it's extremely interesting, the volume of children that were being shipped around the world and the evidence that exists all around the world to indicate that there was a civilization prior to this one not too long ago, and this current civilization simply moved in and took over the real estate. And when I say real estate, what I mean is not just the real estate, but also many of the buildings. And as I've said before, folks, really when you look at our cities, there's no way these cities were built by us. Some of the architecture is just too old. Some of the architecture is just too complicated by our standards. How do we ever do any of this stuff? I mean, we certainly can't do it today. And some of the architecture here in Australia, it's not possible for the settlers to have built this. They simply wouldn't have had the machinery to be able to quarry the stones to build these huge government buildings, which are very old buildings. We've got buildings here that have been here since the late 1700s, and yet this country is supposed to have been colonised in 1770. And yet by 1778 we've got cities. By the early 1800s we've got huge cities, and it's just not possible for these cities to have been built in that time. And evidence would suggest that they weren't built in that time. They were already here. We just simply cleaned them up and moved in and took over the real estate. And of course, when you consider that, then you've got to ask the question, well, what happened to all the people that were in the cities before we came and did the cleanup? You know, what happened to everything, folks? What happened to all the technology? You know, some of the technology that exists in these old buildings, and a lot of them, as I've said before, some of the buildings like churches and some of these very, very complex structures you see around the place, they don't really look like buildings. They look like they're machines. They look like they're energy gathering machines. And I think all buildings were designed to actually gather energy. I think free energy was a reality. I think free energy was part of everyday life, and I think that a lot of these structures were designed with that in mind. And they were designed to harvest energy from the surrounding field. Now, I know it sounds a little outrageous, but there's every indication this is what was going on. Have you looked at some of the old fireplaces in some of the very old buildings? They don't seem very conducive to burning actual fires in there. Some of them are extremely shallow and don't appear to have chimneys attached to them, and there's no grating, no sort of place to actually build the fire. Very strange looking fireplaces. They seem to be connected to a metal type of device, some sort of a metal railing that runs around them, and there's always these two items, like two urns or two little spires that sit at the front of the fireplace, and there's always a metal plate at the back. And perhaps these two metal objects at the front combined in perhaps some sort of positive negative energy field and projected some sort of a beam onto the metal plate at the back, or some sort of energy onto the plate, and the plate itself was what heated up and heated the room. I've been getting a lot of people sending me information out of Russia, which has been really good, so keep that up. And there's also a Russian website that has noticed this and is suggesting that this is a possibility as well. And a lot of these old fireplaces, they've got these setups, folks, and they really don't look very conducive to burning wood. And again, you look at the copper tops of a lot of these buildings and these devices that are all constructed on top of them, you've really got to wonder why they're there. Are they just there for decoration, or is there a higher function to some of these things? There's a building in Florida called the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which has got a very interesting device on top of it. And it looks like it's just some decorative thing, but when you look at the building, this device, it's very unusually shaped and it's made of metal. And it's quite an intricate little device as well, and it's not exactly in a position where people are going to be viewing it. So what's it doing there? And why go to all the trouble to make something so incredibly decorative and to put it up in the center of the roof? And this is quite a big hotel. This is a 540 room hotel. What's it doing with this metal device on the roof? And if it's just there for decorative purposes, why do they make it out of metal? You know, it's very obviously different to the rest of the building. The question is, what's it doing there? Is it just a decoration, or is it actually performing some sort of function? And I would very much suggest that it is performing some sort of function, and that free energy was a reality back in the middle of the last century and is very much still a reality today. It's just that the technology has been hidden from us. And really looking at all this, folks, looking at these foundlings and this whole information about the mud flood that's come out, all the information that's been surfacing lately, it really causes me to question everything. Question everything that I thought I knew about history. And I've spent a lot of time in my life looking into history. It's always been a fascination for me because of all these artifacts lying all over the world, all this weird stuff lying everywhere. You kind of find out about it when you're young and you want to know where it all comes from and what really happened. You know, but all you've got to go on, I mean, all I had to go on for many years was books from academia, books from libraries. I mean, you could go to places and see things, but then you try to research them. All you've really got to go on is local legends and what the books tell you. But there's so much more information surfacing now, and the whole idea of these foundlings, these massive amounts of children being shipped all around the world and being used to run cleanup operations after the mud flood. You've really got to question this, folks. You've really got to look at what happened and where our civilizations came from. And like I said, it causes me to question everything. All of the wars, all of the formation of society as we know it that we've been given anyway. The Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, all of these things, I question all of them now. I don't think any of them have been fought under the pretexts that we've been told. I think all of them are actually all related and are all part of the destruction of this ancient culture, this ancient civilization. And I think it's still ongoing. I think that the war in Syria, the destruction of Aleppo, the war in Yemen, this is all about destroying the infrastructure, destroying the buildings, destroying every trace of the past, any trace of anything that would suggest the existence of Tartaria, of Atlantis, of this lost culture, this lost civilization. It helps me understand the feeling I had when I was a child, why I was so appalled and so disoriented by the fact that people had to pay to be alive and we had to buy land. Why I felt quite literally that some terrible mistake had been made and I'd been born into the wrong reality. It makes me question where my mother really came from. My mother and her 4 sisters, 5 daughters that were just suddenly in Tasmania living out on this property. How did they get there? Were they really born there? My mother remembers her mother was very young and died very early, and she had quite a strict father who married another young woman. But I really begin to question all of it. I really begin to question what my roots are, what my family ties are, what my family tree really is.